In this video, we will be servicing the cooling system in this 2008 Hyundai Elantra. For this service, I have installed Rhino Ramps under the front tires. I have wheel chocks behind the rear tires. I have set the parking brake. And I have installed safety stands just in case the Rhino Ramps fail. Inside the vehicle, I'm going to turn the heat on high because I want to flush the heater core at the same time. Through the driver's side door, we can use our hood release latch to gain access to the engine bay. Taking a look in the engine bay, we first need to locate the coolant reservoir cap. We also need to locate the radiator cap. The coolant reservoir cap has the word coolant on it and is located towards the front of the vehicle on the passenger side. And this cap we're going to open. The radiator cap is located in front of the battery on the driver's side portion of the engine bay near the front of the vehicle. On the top of the radiator cap, we have a warning to never open the cap while hot. If you have been driving your vehicle and the cooling system is hot and pressurized, there is a chance that hot scalding coolant will spray all over you, so you do want to verify and double check and triple check that your engine has been cooled down before you open this. To open the radiator cap, I'm going to place a chunk of rag on top of the cap. I'm going to push down and rotate the cap to the left. Next, we need to locate the radiator drain plug. This is located underneath the vehicle towards the front on the passenger side. This is in the bottom corner of the radiator. We want to make sure that we put some type of a collection bin underneath the drain plug. This is ethylene glycol coolant, which is toxic. Taking a look underneath the vehicle, again, this is in the corner of the radiator on the passenger side of the vehicle. We can see what looks like a large white wing nut. This is the radiator drain plug. Using our fingers, we can begin to loosen that radiator drain plug. While the coolant is draining through the radiator drain plug, we need to locate the lower radiator hose. This is on the driver's side portion of the engine towards the front, but we need to look down inside the engine. We will be looking down between our upper radiator hose and our air intake tube. Our lower radiator hose begins near our upper radiator hose and snakes its way down to the lower portion of the radiator. Looking underneath the vehicle, if we trace that hose to the point at which it enters the radiator, we can see that there is a hose clamp that is holding that on. We'll have to remove the hose clamp before we can continue. After the coolant has finished draining out of the radiator drain plug, I can move my collection bucket underneath my lower radiator hose. And then I can work that lower radiator hose off. And I am actually doing this from the top of the engine. We're next going to shift our attention back to the coolant reservoir located on the passenger side towards the front. There is a hose that is connected to the base of the coolant reservoir. With our collection bucket in place below it, we're going to work that hose off. This will give us access to a 10mm bolt. And on the side of the engine bay, we have a second 10mm bolt to remove. And at this point, we should be able to pull that coolant reservoir out of the engine bay. To make the reservoir easier to read, we want to rinse the reservoir out with soapy water. You could take a brush inside of this and help clean it out as well. Now that the coolant has finished draining, we need to locate the thermostat. This is located towards the center part of the engine on the driver's side of the engine block. The thermostat housing looks like a rounded piece of aluminum with our radiator hoses coming off of it. Currently, the air filter housing is in the way. To get a little bit better access, we will be removing this. One wiring harness on the top, 4 clamps on the sides, and 1 clamp on the top. And a couple 10mm bolts. This will loosen up our air filter housing. We need to remove a couple additional wiring harnesses. And then we can work that out. We now have a much clearer view of our lower radiator hose being attached to our thermostat housing. This is hiding behind a plastic shield. We can take and slip that plastic shield off to get a little better access to that thermostat housing. However, I still have 4 electrical connection points that I'm going to remove to give me a little better access to where I'm working at. The thermostat housing then has 2 12mm nuts that need to be loosened. And with that, we also have a lock washer. We can then work that housing off of those studs. Using a flathead screwdriver, I can very gently work off the gasket that is still holding the thermostat in place. Now that the thermostat has been removed, and I've also removed that gasket, I'm going to leave those off and reinstall my housing. Now I'm reinstalling the housing with the lock washers and the nuts, but I do not have the thermostat and I do not have the gasket installed. We're going to be running some water through the system, and so if it doesn't have a perfectly tight seal, that's alright, because we're just cleaning it out at this point. I'm just going to snug these down as well. I'm not going to torque them to specs. And then I'm going to reinstall the lower radiator hose and move that clamp into place. Next, I'm going to locate my upper radiator hose, and I'm going to follow that until the point at which it enters the radiator. This is on the passenger side towards the front of the vehicle. Using channel locks, we will remove the clamp and work that hose off. We will then install a garden hose into the inlet port on the radiator, and I'm going to direct the upper radiator hose so that it will not be dumping out coolant on the alternator. And make sure you move your bucket in place. We're going to run the water through the hose, which will flush the cooling system. Periodically, you can take a cup and collect some of the water and take a look at it. And we are watching for when the water comes out clear. Not quite clear yet. That looks pretty clear. Once the system is clear, we can turn off the water and drain out the rest of the water through the radiator plug and the lower radiator hose. And then we can reconnect our hoses. We can again remove that thermostat housing. Because we have taken the vehicle apart this far to get the thermostat out, I decided to switch out the thermostat with a new one, as the current thermostat has been in use for about 12 years or so. Additionally, I have a new gasket. The old gasket did not show signs of leaking, but it's always good to replace out the old components for the new components. And one of the things I like to do is make sure that the old thermostat looks similar to the new thermostat, just as I like to make sure that the gaskets look the same. Our gasket here, everything lines up. And our thermostat is looking the same also. Next, we can seat the thermostat in the housing. We want to make sure that the spring side of the thermostat goes in first, and the bleed hole should be located towards the top. Although the old gasket did not have any gasket maker material on it, the repair procedures call for a silicone gasket maker to be applied to both sides of the new gasket. We want to apply an even bead around the gasket and around each of the bolt hole locations. And we're doing this to both sides of the gasket. We want to assemble the parts immediately while the silicone is still wet, and we're going to finger tighten the bolts until the material begins to squeeze out around the flange. Once that silicone has begun to squeeze out around the edge, we're going to let it sit for an hour, and then we're going to come back and torque this to specs. While I'm waiting for the silicone gasket maker to set for an hour, I'm going to shift my attention to the water temperature sensor. And again, because we have this all torn apart and we have easy access to this, we might as well replace it because the one in there is about 12 years old. Using a 19mm wrench, we can loosen up our sensor. And I always like to double check that my new part looks like my old part. And these are looking pretty good. And we can install our new sensor. And as we tighten this, we will want to make sure that we torque it to a range of 84 to 108 inch-pounds. Now that the silicone gasket maker has set up for an hour, we can torque our thermostat housing cover bolts to a range of 108 to 168 inch-pounds. The silicone gasket maker then is required to sit for 24 hours before fully curing and before we can fill this with fluids and return it to service. For now, I'm going to reinstall a lot of the components that we had previously taken off. We are pretty much done with this repair, aside from putting everything back on and filling up the system. We can then shift our attention over to the coolant reservoir and getting that reinstalled after we've cleaned it out. And don't forget that coolant reservoir hose. You also want to go back through and double check all of your radiator hose connections. The last new part that I will be switching out is the radiator cap. As with the other new components, we want to make sure that the new one looks like the old one. The coolant that we pulled out was an ethylene glycol mixture. That mixture is extremely toxic. We will be installing a propylene glycol coolant. This is Amsoil's Antifreeze and Coolant formulation. This is a low toxicity, biodegradable product. The specifications call for a 60% propylene glycol, 40% water mixture. After doing some math, I have calculated the level of 40% on a 1 gallon milk jug. I drew a line all the way around that. So my water will be filled up to the 40% mark. I will fill the rest with Amsoil's antifreeze and coolant formulation, and that will give me a 60-40 ratio. And for this, I am using distilled water. Now that our silicone gasket maker has fully cured, we can fill the system with our 60-40 propylene glycol coolant mixture. I'm going to be filling this through the radiator cap location, and we will do this slowly and let the system fill up. As you fill it, you can gently squeeze the radiator hoses to help remove some of the air in the hoses. You can let gravity do its job as well. The coolant reservoir should also be filled up to the max full location. With the radiator cap removed and the heat set to full high heat, we're going to run the vehicle for about 5 minutes and let the engine heat up so that the thermostat will open, which will get the coolant flowing in the engine. When the coolant has begun flowing, the upper radiator hose should feel hot. After the engine has warmed up and our coolant has flowed through the engine, we can turn the vehicle off, let it cool down, double check our level, and reinstall the radiator cap. And as you drive the car, you'll want to check the levels several times, topping it off as needed.